Hello and welcome to my channel, The Future Empress. My name is Anna and today I'm gonna give you some audiobook recommendations. So I am a person that at first couldn't really get into audiobooks because I mainly obtain knowledge by having it physically in my hands or seeing it with my eyes. So obtaining knowledge by listening I have a bit of difficulty towards. So therefore I was late to the audiobook game. I didn't pick up an audiobook that wasn't a reread until 2 years ago. This year so far 63.9% of my reading has been done by audiobook. So I adapted fast, but it also takes a lot of work from my side. Since I'm not a native English speaker, I sometimes have to rewind in the audiobook just to be able to probably pick it up, because sometimes I can't hear what they're saying. If the accent is very hard or very thick, I usually have to rewind a lot more, or if it's language that I'm not used to listening to or reading, it takes a lot of me to process and get into that structure of language and words. So sometimes I actually can't even get into an audiobook and I have to pick it down to read it physically. But mainly I don't have any problems. It's rarely that I put down an audiobook to read it physically, but it does happen. So today I am recommending the best audiobooks that I've listened to in my short period time of doing audiobooks. I have 9 books to talk about, so let's just get into it. The first book I want to talk about is one I listened to very recently, and that is Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert. I also recommend the sequel since I'm currently listening to that one, and that is Take a Hint, Danny Brown. I gave Get a Life, Chloe Brown 4 stars and I really enjoyed it, and I think my biggest enjoyment of this book was how the audiobook was read. So the narrator is Angela Ando, and she does such a great job in portraying the British accent and the difference in the class accent, how the two main characters actually speak and pronounce things. There's a slight difference in it, and for me, who is not from UK, it really sets the setting of the novel to show me how the different accents are, because I wouldn't have known it by myself since I'm not from UK, so I would not have known the differences in accents. So the accent really just helped set the book and give me a better understanding of the British culture and setting that is in the book that I wouldn't get on my own, and that's why I recommend listening to this one on audiobook. It's so good and she does such a great job narrating it. It took me a while to get into the accents though, because it was very heavy British, for me at least, who's not a native speaker. So it took me some time to get into the audiobook. However, when I was enjoying it 100%. I do not regret listening to the audiobook, and I would do it again, to be honest. It was such a good read. So for every audiobook, I'm gonna play like 10 seconds of the audiobook clip with you, so you can just get a taste.
Oh, you are a gem, Red. Redford Morgan attempted a cheerful grin, which wasn't easy when he was elbow deep in an octogenarian's toilet bowl. Just doing my job, Mrs. Conrad. You're the best superintendent we've ever had, she cooed from the bathroom doorway, clasping one wrinkled hand to her bony chest.
The next audiobook that I want to talk about is Beautiful Creatures by Cami Garcia and Margaret Stahl. I listened to this one back in the beginning of 2018, and the reason I really enjoyed it was because of the audiobook. I had tried to get into this book twice before, but physically, but I never really got further than the first chapter, or like the prologue and the first chapter. So when I was starting to play a little with audiobooks and found out that the book was on script, I thought, why not try to at least finish the first book and see if I actually enjoyed it, because it was originally recommended to me from my best friend. She really enjoyed Beautiful Creatures and the series, so I wanted to give it my third chance to at least try to finish it for her sake, and I'm really glad that I did. The sound effects of the audiobook itself is so beautifully done, and it really helps set that creepy, eerie mood, and I recommend it especially for this kind of season. If you haven't read Beautiful Creatures yet, I really do recommend you listen to it on audiobook. That's how I got through it. I honestly think I wouldn't have been able to finish this book if I hadn't read the audiobook, and I ended up picking up all the books in the series by audiobook and thoroughly enjoyed it. This audiobook is narrated by Kevin T. Collins, and while he does a really great job of narrating, usually when men narrates, it's kind of weird when you hear from the female's perspective, but it wasn't in this case. I would not say that it was weird. He did a great job. What really put this audiobook on my list of best audiobooks that I've listened to is the cinematics and the sound effects, and just there's a song and something intertwined with the story, and when that part in the story comes up, they actually sing, and there's actually like instrumental in the background sometimes as well. So it's really such a good audiobook to listen to, especially if you haven't read it yet. I do recommend it for the spooky season. So let's listen to a sample of it.
I sat up with a jerk, trying to catch my breath. "Ethan, wait! Wake up! I won't have you being late on the first day of school." I could hear Amma's voice calling from downstairs. My eyes focused on a patch of dim light in the darkness. I could hear the distant drum of the rain against our old plantation shutters.
So as you heard, there's sound effects with the rain. There's like, when he's dreaming, he has this eerie dream, and there's like voices, and it's like spooky, and it's just one of the best audiobooks that I have listened to. The production that went into these audiobooks were so amazing, and that's probably why I rated them so high. I gave the first book 4 stars, and honestly 1 star is for the audiobook purely. It was so good. I'm so glad that I decided to listen to them on audiobook. The next book I want to talk about is Me by Elton John. This is his autobiography of his life and experiences, and it's narrated by Taron Egerton. And if you have seen the movie Rocketman, Taron Egerton actually plays Elton John in the movie. So overall, if you've seen the movie and if you're interested in reading this autobiography by Elton John, I highly recommend listening to the audiobook. Elton John does the introduction and the outro of the audiobook, but in between those two, it's all Taron Egerton. He does it so well, I think, because he played Elton John in the movies, and he really encapsulated who Elton John is from the portraying of the movie, and then when he recorded the audiobook, he already had a role he could put himself in. Taron Egerton is such a good narrator for Elton John. I would not have picked any other, and I'm sure Elton John agrees with me. It was so good. I gave this book 5 out of 5 stars. I really loved it, and I love the fact that Elton John made the introduction and the outro himself. It just overall makes a good picture, and I highly recommend this audiobook as well. If you want to like venture into autobiographies, or you haven't listened to any non-fiction yet, this is a good book to start with, I would think. I have not listened to any non-fiction before this, so I think this is a good book to start with if you want to. Let's listen to the sample of Me by Elton John.
It was my mum who introduced me to Elvis Presley. Every Friday after work, she would pick up her wages, stop off on the way home at Sivers, an electrical store that also sold records, and buy a new 78. It was my favourite time of the week, waiting at home to see what she would bring back.
The next book I want to talk about is How to Train Your Dragon by Cressida Cowell. I recommend all the books in the series. There's like 12 or something. The reason I recommend these as audiobooks is because David Tennant narrates the whole series is in his own Scottish accent, and it's just so good. If you didn't know, David Tennant is the 10th Doctor in Doctor Who, and I am a big Doctor Who fan, so when I noticed that How to Train Your Dragon was narrated by him, I was instantly intrigued. And then when I actually listened to the audiobooks and heard that he did it in his own fantastical accent, and it just fits so well with the story, and it's so fun. He makes the audiobooks more fun than I think they would be if I physically read them. I gave the first book, I think, 4 stars or like 4.5 stars. I highly recommend it, and if you're new to middle grade and want to get into it, How to Train Your Dragon is such a good series to start with. It's most likely a story that you're already familiar with. However, the movies of How to Train Your Dragons are so different from the actual story of How to Train Your Dragon, like the original material. So don't expect that it's the first movie when you go in. You just have to like be open-minded, and when you hear it at first, you're like, wait, this is not How to Train Your Dragon, because they changed a lot in the movies. But I still highly recommend the books. I wouldn't say the books are better than the movie, because I like the movies for what they are, and I like the books for what they are. Like, I appreciate both, and I won't pick between them, honestly, because they're both so good. And the audiobooks are short as well, so it's like 4 to 5 hours long, and if you listen to more than one, like the original speed, if you listen to like 1.5 speed, you can easily finish it in a day. So it's just a nice kind of in between heavy books, like longer books. It's nice to like take a step back from the heavy books or the long books and just listen to a quick audiobook, and then your mind are cleansed, and then you go back to another one. And then for a snippet of How to Train Your Dragon.
About the author. How to Train Your Dragon is the first volume of Hiccup's memoirs. He is better known for his great work of natural history, Viking Dragons and Their Eggs, which lists every dragon known to man. He has also published 2 other non-fiction titles, Learning to Speak Dragonese and Mermaids and Other Monsters, and is a regular writer for Big Dragon Monthly.
So yeah, there's also like cinematics in that one as well as the Beautiful Creatures ones, and it just makes the audiobook even better. The next book I want to talk about is The Martian by Andy Weir. This book itself is set up for like the perfect audiobook, because the main character is actually just talking to himself throughout the book while he is solving the problems that occur. The narrator, R.C. Bray, did it so well. He made the story entertaining to listen to, even though it could be heavy when it's just a person talking to himself. He's not interacting with anyone else, physically at least, and the narrator just does such a good job that keeps the book being entertaining. And this book is such a good book just in itself, and if you already knew, it's a movie, and if you've seen the movie and haven't read the books, I recommend listening to the book as well, because the movie shows one thing and the book shows another, and I just highly recommend the book as well, because even though you've seen the movie, there's still so much in the book that isn't portrayed in the movie as well, because the movie you're just watching a person being alone on a planet trying to get home, but in the book you're really just following his thought process, because you're literally just in his head, and it's just so good. Let's listen to the snippet of this one.
Log entry. Sol 6. I'm pretty much fucked. That's my considered opinion. Fucked. 6 days into what should be the greatest 2 months of my life, and it's turned into a nightmare. I don't even know who'll read this. I guess someone will find it eventually, maybe 100 years from now. For the record, I didn't die on Sol 6.
The next book I want to talk about is Stacy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This is a highly hyped book, and for good reasons. The formatting of this one is what I would say makes for a perfect audiobook. There's not only one narrator in this book, there's multiple narrators for every new person that is introduced, so it really just feels like a real interview and documentary about this group and Stacy Jones. So Audible says that it's narrated by Jennifer Beals, Benjamin Bratt, Judy Greer, and Pablo Schreiber. I think a lot more people cameos. The general story is that there's a reporter that is interviewing Stacy Jones and the Six and getting to know their story and how it all evolved, because nobody in the world actually knows what went within the group and why they broke up. And it's told in an interview style, so it's pure dialogue between the interviewer and the interviewee. Sometimes there's like an article put in. For me, that makes it the perfect audiobook setting, and Furthermore, the narrators of this book just makes it so much better. They do such a great job in portraying this story and really making it feel like these people are real. So I highly recommend that you listen to Stacy Jones and the Six as an audiobook if you haven't read this book yet. It's highly hyped and there's a reason for the hype. I gave this one 5 stars. Of course, it's probably as good physically reading it, but I think like the audiobook is the way to go with this one. Let's listen to the sample of Stacy Jones and the Six.
I could walk to the strip from my house. I was about 14, sick of being stuck in the house, just looking for something to do. I wasn't old enough to get into any of the bars and clubs, but I went anyway.
And before I continue on, I just want to mention The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid as well. This is not told in the same style as Stacy Jones and the Six, but I still highly recommend this as an audiobook itself. It's narrated by Alma Cuervo, Julia Wieland, and Robin Miles, and they do such a great job as well. It's also kind of an interview style, but more of a traditional format where we have like the main character who is interviewing another character, and that's where the interview style comes in. You jump into her head while she tells the story, but other than that it's just a traditionally formed novel. But I still recommend this one as an audiobook as well, but not as much as Stacy Jones and the Six. This is just like the perfect audiobook of her books. However, I also recommend The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo because it was such a good read as well, and I listened to it on audiobook, gave it 5 out of 5 stars. The next book I want to talk about is It by Stephen King. This is a long book. It's over 1,000 pages long and it's just a thick boy. And I honestly don't think I would have read it this fast if I hadn't listened to it on audiobook. It's kind of eerie as well, and the way it's narrated is very good. Like the narration of it is also one of the better narrations that I've listened to. It's just not like on par with a lot of these books on my list, however, but it's still a good narration, and it's narrated by Steven Weber. And he does a really great job of portraying all these different characters, and you can hear that it's distinctly a switch over to another person's perspective. And there is some cinematics and sound effects in this one as well. And it just like, I really recommend reading it as an audiobook, because reading it physically could take ages long, but listening to it on audiobook, it is around 45 hours long. But imagine if you had to physically read it. I get so lazy when I physically read. I don't usually physically read for a lot of hours. However, when I'm listening to an audiobook, I find myself like listening to it a lot of hours, because I just find stuff that I can do while I listen to my audiobook and continue listening if I'm interested. And it's 46 hours. However, I still think I finished it under 2 weeks, and I just recommend going this way because it's a thick book. And if you wanted to get into Stephen King, or you wanted to just read it, it's such a thick book. It's one of his biggest books, if not the biggest. I gave it 4 stars, but I honestly just think that if I've read it physically, I wouldn't have enjoyed it as much, because I think the length of it is a bit of a problem. Let's just listen to this snippet of it and you can judge yourself if you want to listen to it or not.
The terror, which would not end for another 28 years, if it ever did end, began, so far as I know or can tell, with a boat made from a sheet of newspaper floating down a gutter swollen with rain.
The next book I want to talk about is With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is just such an amazing book in itself. The writing is so beautiful, and there's like recipes inside it, and the cover is stunning. Its nakedness is stunning as well. Like, look at these fruits, and the narration is amazing as well. It just like, this is a perfect book. It's narrated by the author itself. When the author narrates their books themselves, most of the time it just makes the book so much better, because they understand the book. They know what they meant to portray with this book, so they know what the characters and how the characters say the certain sentences. But sometimes when authors narrate their own books, they just aren't talented narrating a book. They're talented writing stories, but reading stories aloud is a different quality to have, and some authors just don't have that. However, Elizabeth Acevedo has that quality. She is a master of that quality, and that's the reason I want to get into more for other books, even though I know they are written in verse. This is a normal formatting book. This is written in full-on text, but I feel like her writing style, you can tell that she's written books in verse as well, because it's just so beautifully crafted. I highly recommend listening to this one on audiobook if you haven't read this book yet. If I can't convince you to listen to this one on audiobook, let Elizabeth Acevedo convince you.
I braid to the very tip of her hair. The design is simple. Some straight backs with a pink hair tie at the end that matches baby girl's outfit. A little white collared shirt and pink pullover. She looks adorable.
I know that she has other books, and I want to mention them here because she narrates them as well. There's The Poet X, which is her debut novel. It's written in verse. Then she came out with this one, and then this year she came out with Clap When You Land, and that is written in verse as well. But she narrates all her audiobooks, so I just wanted to mention it here. I haven't read them yet, but I think they're probably gonna be as amazing as this one. The last book I want to mention is A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. There is a lot of audiobooks of this one. The one I listened to was by Anton Lesser. I really enjoyed his narration of it, and his accent also just fitted the story in itself. He was such a good storyteller, and if you haven't read A Christmas Carol yet, I highly recommend you doing so. And if you see yourself you don't want to pick it up because it's a classic, so the language is a bit different. The audiobooks is very short, like it's a short story to begin with, but the audiobook feels shorter. I don't know why audiobooks always feel shorter than reading things physically, but it does. Also, just the sound effects in this audiobook is also very good. So let's just listen to the little snippet.
Stave 1. Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to.
So that's all the audiobooks I'm gonna talk about today. These are my top 9. I've listened to a lot of audiobooks, but these are just like god tier of audiobooks that I've personally listened to. I know there's a lot of other audiobooks out there that people recommend. Example, Illuminate that I have here, or The Diviners. I know people recommend this book a lot, especially the audiobook of it, but I haven't listened to those yet, so I didn't want to talk about them when I actually don't know if they're top god tier of audiobooks. If you know any more audiobooks that you know were amazing, please let me know down below, and let me know which your favorite audiobook is. I'm always looking for audiobook recommendations since I do a lot of my reading by audiobook, as I mentioned in the intro of this video. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I guess see you next time. Bye!